Pete Bommarito. I'm the owner of Bommarito Performance Systems and Bommarito University. So a lot of people, I think, are a little surprised when we talk about how we don't focus on the warm-up. Now, keep in mind that our preparation sequence will, by default, elevate tissue temperature, which is warming up. But prior to a training session, whether it be a game, a practice, a speed and or conditioning-based session, or weight room-based session, your preparation for that session should not focus on warming up. Because you can do anything random that could be appropriate or inappropriate, but it doesn't just to warm up. Anybody can just do random exercises and get warm, elevating tissue temperature. But was it appropriate for that individual at that moment in time for his developmental growth cycle, sport, his and her level of training, season in the sport, everything. So I think we have to look at the exercises of preparation being appropriate, meaning that you can progress the different segments of the body and their ability to absorb and redirect force. So hence you should be training minute one, not warming up and then training. So the training is, to start out would be preparation. Now because our preparation sequences are moving, by default you're warming up. But your focus, your mindset, your programming, and the way you coach it has to be progressive. So that's the first tip, is look at the body in the segments. You have support system, the joints of the toes, the forefoot, the rear foot, the ankle, and the knee. That entire linked system is the support system. Then you have suspension, which is the knee up into the hips, up into the pelvis. Then obviously you have the trunk and spine, which is the pelvis, up the spine, and obviously the articulating limbs like the arms and the shoulder blade, the neck, and the head. Those are the three main segments you want to focus on with absorbing and redirecting force. So a lot of people are talking about warming up and static stretching versus dynamic stretching, and all these different types of arguments in terms of what's a proper warm-up, when they should be thinking about, with this individual at this moment in time, even in a group setting, what is their appropriate level to absorb and redirect force, and how do I raise that threshold of absorbing and redirecting force, whether it be the support, suspension, or trunk. And if you think about it in those terms, that's what gains the flexibility and the mobility that you're so desperately looking for. Usually what people look for is up into the hips, or this, what I call the suspension. So we have a series of exercises that is basic versus advanced for absorbing and redirecting forces in the support. Basic and advanced for absorbing and redirecting forces in the suspension. The same thing up in the trunk and spine. So if I'm running a group and I choose to do 10 minutes of support system prep, the exercise selection, the speed of the exercise needs to be altered to the individual, even in a group or even on a team. Now it's easy to do if they're doing the same types of sequences, so you don't interrupt the flow of the intensity of the group you're trying to coach. But you have to think about it in terms of basic versus advanced, growing versus fully grown, meaning going through peak height velocity or puberty, or fully grown, or prior to that growth spurt. So those types of things are paramount in your ability to prepare well for the session itself, but prepare the body for the entire training cycle over time. And because these exercises are usually moving in nature, again, by default, you're elevating tissue temperature. So I don't think that warming up is not important. I just think that the coaches and the trainer's focus should be on, how do I progressively absorb and redirect that force? Okay, so a few examples. Let's start the support system. The most difficult to comprehend because the muscles crossing those joints of the toe, forefoot, rear foot, and ankle are very small. These aren't muscles you can put into a machine in a weight room and train and develop. But you can develop that same rate of force on a field. So if I'm doing back dorsiflex series, this is a great sequence of absorbing force. However, if somebody is elite enough, you could just speed it up or go on a multi-directional angle or do different types of cord and or sled resistance. So you can have people doing the same exercise sequence in multiple lines within a group, but obviously the most basic people will do it slow because that's their progressive level of what they can absorb in terms of that force. The faster you go, the higher the force. The more resistant work you put, the more multi-directional motions you put on, the greater the force. So think of it as lifting weights on a turf. The weight you're lifting is your body with gravity, and the force is still increased by the speed of the limb and the speed of that resisting that force coming down. That's absorbing force, or accepting body weight. Accepting body weight at the basic level is just a step recover. Just getting the foot, the toes to bend, absorb, and accept. Or you could do different levels of jump to stabilization, speed up the limb, speed up the landing, increase the challenge, increase the force. And again, different multi-directional angles and different cord and or sled resistance. So again, for accepting body weight, you can still have a basic line and an advanced line of doing that. Or baseline of redirecting force, which is baseline plyometrics, where you could just work on different types of individual limb functions, or same type of redirecting force, but now, because I'm only on one foot, I'm absorbing a lot more force because all my body weight is crashing down on one foot. So baseline plows versus advanced plows. And you could do the same thing with a reach skip and same thing with heavy eccentric loading forces. So these exercises can be progressive in nature to fit the individual, but be progressive in nature over time. The trunk and spine could be isometric, it could be integrated. So integrated might just be sled marching. So I think people are surprised sometimes when they say, okay, we have this middle school team. We have this freshman in high school group or team. They're always tight. Why are they tight? They're tight because they're growing. When you go through that peak height velocity, that puberty, you lose the ability to absorb and redirect force. A lot of times it's down the support up in the trunk and spine. So the best way to get them to loosen up their hips isn't necessarily a series of dynamic stretches. It's getting them strong in their hip extensors, isometrically strong in their trunk rotators, trunk lateral flexors. So some of the best technical warm-up exercises we do with young kids is different levels of sled resistance, single arm. So if I'm just doing a basic motion here, what am I working on concentrically? Hip extension. What am I working on isometrically? Trunk rotation. If I do the same sequence lateral around the waist, I'm looking at abduction, adduction. If I go single arm, I'm looking at hip, suspension, abduction, adduction, trunk and spine lateral flexion. So if you get your trunk and spine isometrically strong, especially rotation lateral flexion for a young growing kid, and they get that symmetrical with the high level of threshold of absorbing and redirecting force, then the guarding patterns come off the suspension, the hips open up, and you haven't even attacked the hips yet. Now it's more appropriate to do suspension type prep, which is the typical active dynamic warm-ups you're gonna see. So young kids, again, are tight because they're weak. If you can get these types of strengthening mechanisms up in the spine, you're gonna be a lot more effective with the overall thing.